Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. My name is Mr. Dogbout333, and this is Development Diary 30, Part 4. Now, last time we were here together, we went through a lot of the mechanics that are going to be coming with the first couple of years of the new U.S. content in the Nixon administration. Went over the possible impeachment of William Douglas, which... I believe I spread a bit of false news. It turns out, as I read a little bit further down, that impeachment is not railroaded. It can potentially be undone, which is going to be very interesting to see. But a lot of the core stuff there, with the dubiousness of Nixon and his attempts to reshape public image to his beliefs and his beliefs to public image, does set up a pretty interesting dynamic that could potentially kick off. But as some of you know with the existing TNO lore, which seems to largely be staying intact from my understanding, there are going to be some crises that are going to pop up. Now, let's hop into that right now. One area of unity between the President and Kennedy will forever be the country's need to combat the evil dominating Europe, the Greater German Reich. Encroaching German influence across the globe is the greatest threat to liberty today. When there are people united in the cause for freedom, yearning to be liberated from the jackboot of the Reich, Republicans and Democrats can lay their party squabbles aside to come to their aid. Nowhere is that more apparent than in the French colony of Madagascar, where bipartisan coalitions are eager to aid the liberal pro-democracy faction of French-educated rebels against their oppressors. The problem presents itself in the form of the Japanese. Already establishing themselves among their contacts on the island, American assistance is severely limited, both by international law and political reality. The arming of Malagasy liberation fighters, and in turn, arming the Japanese, is poison to the public. Subverting the powers of Congress is unambiguously illegal. If the action in that theater becomes too brazen, there will undoubtedly be a shared hell for the administration as a whole. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this is how this is set up already with TNO. I think they changed it to the fact that Nixon gets impeached over Madagascar, potentially, which adds some strangeness to, if you manage to do it undetected and do that, then why does Nixon get impeached anyway? And that is now that's going to be answered by the fact that in this new update, Nixon can avoid impeachment, which makes a lot of sense. So I don't know how much it's different. I haven't done the Madagascar stuff at all, so I'm gonna just refrain on that. But we'll just skip ahead of that, and we'll keep on keeping on. While President Nixon continues his backdoor rampage, speculation on who shall lead the Democrats to face him next year continues to mount. President Kefauver has remained a spiritual leader for the Democrats since he departed from the White House 3 years ago. Between meetings at union halls and periodic state-by-state tours, begins to circulate the former president may not be able to get over the presidential bug. An untimely death soon lays all rumors to bed, only to follow the VP like a curse. In a White House where he's already branded himself at odds with the president and his intentions for 64 lack subtlety since first run with Kefauver, becoming the front runner for his party will hang around Kennedy's neck like an albatross. So these are events talking about, maybe Estes could come back in 64. Then there's an event outright saying, no, he's not, because he's dead. And then it's people speculating about Kennedy stepping in at 64, like he's been kind of indicating. So these are the first people stepping into the rink, and all the speculation is enough to seal his fate. Every step of the way through the Nixon's occupancy of the White House, Kennedy has stood in its way. From Douglas to the Civil Rights Act, Kennedy's been making the pursuit of consistent foreign policy agenda torture. It's only natural that he'd face retribution. In coordination with Hoover, loosely sourced from the White House, the worst-kept secret in American politics will be forced to the front pages of newspapers worldwide. Vice President Kennedy is dying, and he's lying to the public to stay in power. Now, this is probably, I think, one of the most interesting changes we have going on in the TNO timeline. First off, it avoids the cliche of Jack Kennedy dying by a bullet, and instead it plays on his Addison's disease and stuff like that. This first event, again, I'm going to be summarizing these. If you want to read these events, you can go ahead and do so in the Dev Diary. I love to read the events, but for sake of brevity and getting through the rest of his content, I'm going to skim through them. But this is Nixon and Hoover realizing that Jack has Addison's disease, and they could play that against him, get out of the office. This is the event where, well, the story comes out, and he's recommended to resign. Bobby comforts him. And then finally, this is where Jack Kennedy resigns. And that, of course, leads to the vacancy. Recent chaos in the executive branch has led to a serious shakeup in Washington. With the president out of their post, the VP is constitutionally ordered to replace him as leader of the free world. But nobody's mandated to fill in as number 2. As such, the vice presidency remains empty for as long as it takes for the Senate to confirm a new vice president, or for a new administration to be elected. In the meantime, the Secretary of State sits as next in line for the presidential succession under the Succession Act of 1886, followed by the Secretary of the Treasury. This is before, I forget the exact amendment that's passed. But the current change of succession is that if the president and the vice president die, the Speaker of the House becomes president. So if Trump and Vance were killed today, for example, Mike Johnson would be elevated. Then it goes president pro tempore, or I think that's it. Which I don't know who it is at the time. Before it was Leahy or Smith or one of the senators from Washington. I don't know who it is now that Republicans are in charge. But that passed after a constitutional amendment, I think the 60s or the 70s. So they're going off old laws with the Secretary of State. And so Kennedy's early departure, any potential candidacy he could launch would be seen rightfully as a joke. Instead, the Democrats will have to have their past claw their way back to relevance. The has-beens of Johnson and Stevenson, domineering figures in their own right, could easily be branded as failing to inspire. Fair or not, there's still plenty viable to topple Nixon's shaky standing. So these events go through Lyndon Johnson trying to go all the way. And then Adlai Stevenson, who in our timeline ran against Eisenhower both times for the presidency and did as well as he can when you run against Dwight fucking Eisenhower. And then early on it's established that it seems to be a Johnson versus Stevenson battle. But it doesn't end up being that way. Johnson representing the other Democrats makes sense in this context, I suppose, just because his reputation beforehand. But we'll get to that later. Though neither can seemingly wrestle with time, another man of astounding out, Johnson's second run for the presidency will shut down much like the first, a heart attack. It sets in for Johnson soon after a man of his health given yet another delay. He will never be president. As for Stevenson, pending the arrival of new candidates and also feeling his age, he will also suspend his campaign. So we go from this deep in where the candidates have won primaries to all of a sudden nobody's running other than some favorite sons who don't have a chance of winning. Now, the old Democratic primary was structured in that it was very party boss heavy and oriented. That changed after 1968, after Hubert Humphrey was pretty much given the nomination, despite the upset victory of McCarthy, the upset performance of Eugene McCarthy. I think, did he win more contests? I know Humphrey didn't, but I forget who did. I know RFK won a fair few before. Well, we know what happened there. That changed in 1972. Where it became more democratic. Before then, it's a lot of bigger conventions, but a lot of backroom deals as well. But We'll get there, I'm sure, deeper, either in this or once the mod comes out. All while the Democratic death march continues, Nixon will face the fallout of his own vice president's resignation. The public is never not hungry for the drama. It's an urge that's been around long before the Douglas impeachment. Now the monsters are sent for Nixon, believing that Kennedy has dirt, some even say tapes, detailing alleged crimes committed by the president. Gossip begins to spread that Kennedy may seek out revenge for being pushed out of the cabinet. Now this is about books and the fun gossip that may come. Of course, by year's end, it may not materialize. Kennedy's already put his family through so much. If he isn't sure it'll be enough to bring Nixon to justice, what would the point even be? However, and this is where things are going to get interesting, had things gone differently, had Douglas survived impeachment, the Civil Rights Act maintained its peak strength, and public revelations about American involvement in Madagascar returned to the White House, Nixon would become a target. The public rage he may have tried to bring just as Douglas turns back on him, and Nixon weakened. Weakened, they could only fight from a position of weakness. The countdown towards impeachment begins. Now this first one towards down some of the unsavory actions with Kennedy releasing some dirt. Meanwhile, this has Haldeman, who's Nixon's chief of staff, I forget exactly, starting to be alienating and starting to turn away from President Nixon. It's all out there. Anything said in public can be expected to come out. It's the end. The aura of invulnerability Nixon hoped to cultivate has been irrevocably penetrated, leaving him vulnerable to condemnation across the aisle. It's all too much. Between the endless and increasing desperate bargain, the White House is out of time. And here is, of course, the resignation branch. This is Lodge Jr. talking with Earl Warren, preparing him to become president. This is the Republican heads telling Nixon he's fucked, basically. This is Earl Warren talking with Nixon. And this is Nixon accepting the fact that he's probably going to... he's saying he's going to resign. And then this is what this all culminates in. President Earl Warren. We get a little brief focus tree. It looks like a lot of trying to reconcile things and initiate some cleaner government options. Interesting. Let's go ahead and read the bio real quick, because we always do this. Earl Warren has always held himself in high regard. He is a doer, bridge builder, a virtuoso politician. In his own estimation, Earl Warren is the fairest, most honest, and decent man in Washington. Anyone should feel lucky to have him as their boss. Anyone should feel grateful for the enormous talents he brings to the office of the president. Gallup polling suggests a few Americans feel the same way. Most do not associate Warren with his humble origins in Oakland politics, nor his even-handed governance of California during the difficult 1940s. Most instead associate him closely with the cataclysmic failure of the Nixon administration, whose implosion has sent shockwaves throughout the political system. They view him as aware of, if not directly responsible for, the Madagascar affair that saw American weapons shipped off to their Japanese adversaries. Amid intensifying hearings into the misconduct of his predecessor, the words that most Americans associate with Earl Warren are criminal and traitor. Though he believes himself to be above the political fray, to be safe for the American establishment in these trying times, Republicans and Democrats alike have reason to loathe the new commander-in-chief. If he cannot prove his worth and demonstrate the exact qualities he claims to possess, Warren may discover how quickly a determined Congress can move to impeach. And then we have the little note from Nixon to his successor, which I think is kind of funny. Usually I have these very elaborate ones, but from his Dear Mr. Secretary, I hereby resign the office of the President of the United States. Sincerely, Richard Nixon. It's short, to the point. You also have some unique options for Earl Warren and his interactions and his little legislative stuff. All interesting stuff. Regardless of standing Nixon found himself in by the year's halfway point, the Democratic primaries continue unchanged. With the race wide open, fresh blood has finally emerged. Of course, frayed in three different ways, two of which are competing for the ardent liberals, division will inevitably ensue. So this is where we hop into the presidential options. So we have 3 different candidates for the 64 primaries. Representing the Yaller Democrats is George Wallace. George Wallace is already in the mod, running for the NPP. In our timeline, he was the governor of Alabama. You may know him for being the segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever guy. Robert Kennedy's also in the mod, also running for the NPP. The fact that these 2 men can run for the same party is kind of proof that the NPP was kind of silly. Fun, sometimes, but silly. Jack Kennedy's brother, senator in our timeline in New York, in this timeline Boston, also Attorney General during JFK's administration. And the Hubert Humphrey used to be Bobby Kennedy's VP in the original war of TNO. Then he just got moved to senator. And now he's a full-blown presidential candidate. I'll go ahead and let... Now, do I want to read... I'll actually read these ones so we get a feel of who these candidates are. Yeah, why not? Asa Carter lit another cigarette and took a long, deep puff backstage. He looked towards George Wallace, who himself looked out of the sea of the press awaiting by the stage. The press did the only thing they knew how to do, endlessly and endlessly chatter. It was deafening. Carter spoke. Now, sir, if I may, about the speech, sir. Oh, that's a him, okay. Wallace turned away from off. Yes, it's excellent. Exactly what I needed. Thank you very much. If I may, with Johnson out of the race, we have a real chance at winning this thing. Carter began rummaging through his pockets. I have some notes here on how we can broaden your appeal in the northern states. Asa, are you a man that understands? You are a man that understands people. That's why you write succession speeches. Yet you feel to understand the nation. Do you really think that they can sympathize with the black man? They claim all men are brothers, yet they live in their white ethno-states. They claim to want integration, yet they have lines dividing their cities. They claim to support the black man, yet hire none. Do you see it? Whether it's north or south, no one wants to use the same doorknob as a colored man. And I plan to give them exactly what they want. There is no need to broaden appeal, Carter. Wallace steps out on the stage to a flurry of camera clicks. I am here to announce my presidency for my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. The only difference between regions is subtlety, and George Wallace will take the lead for Yaller Democrats. Meanwhile, we have fanfare for Public Man. If there was nervousness hiding in Hubert H. Humphrey for a speech of this magnitude, he wasn't showing it in front of this friendly crowd of Minnesotans. He had no reason to. They had filled the streets in front of the mayor's office in Minneapolis, where he had gotten his start, waving signs, parading Union banners, and straining for a glimpse of their senator, perhaps soon to be president. Journalists took notes of a smile stretched across his broad face as he plowed through his speech. It was Lyndon Johnson who challenged our nation to think, to use our vast natural wealth, and to advance our civilization. I have always considered Lyndon a mentor, a friend, and a fellow soldier in our lifelong battles for the democratic cause. And I know I'm not alone in wishing him the best in his recovery. Applause filled the humid summer air as Humphrey grinned, tilting his head as he surveyed the crowd. Senator Johnson understood that our nation in recent years has been suffering from a lack of vision. Small-minded politicians have chosen cowardice over courage and expedience over excellence. We need a leader who will not duck the hard fights, a leader who has the will to deliver on those great issues of today, the right to organize, the right to liberty, and the right to equality. The crowd erupts into cheers and whistles, and Humphrey himself couldn't resist laughing and clapping with them. Finally, he gathered himself back to his speech. And when I am your next president of these United States, you will have that leader. Never waited for cheers washed across the stage, and Hubert Humphrey soaked in it. Finally, we have the third brother's Camelot. Robert Kennedy looked around his family. They still have the look of soldiers armed for battle. John, visibly weary but still unbent, shook his hand firmly. Their father looked him in the eye, nodded, and said, "See to it." Robert nodded his assent and crossed himself to the approval's mother. Wild applause and cheers were all that could be heard at the convention ballroom. Streamers and ballrooms were flying all over the place. The master of ceremonies cried out, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to introduce you all to the next president of these United States of America, Robert Francis Kennedy." Somehow as Robert walked out, the cheers got louder. He hadn't thought it possible, but his confidence had been boosted by the Democrats in the chimeric Nixon administration, who had all lined up behind him. With that boosted confidence and the faith reposed in him by his family, somehow both including his ruthlessly ambitious father and his gentler devout mother, he forged ahead. The speech made that confidence clear. He insisted that he was the right man to bring about a resolution to the ongoing crisis. The times are difficult, and the office is onerous. But with my experience and past work on behalf of American citizens, as many of you who have given me your vote have observed, I am confident that I am well placed to ensure that these United States remain beautiful and free. Once again, wild applause and cheers. JFK may have been sent down, but the Democratic Party was more than willing to take another Kennedy. Camelot, done differently. So RFK takes the lead for the activist Democrats, and Hubert Humphrey takes the lead for the establishment Democrats. Arriving in Detroit, the Democrats must put aside their differences aside and come together under their elected standard bearer. While the primaries may have been fraught with division, staring down 4 years of uncontested rule. Nixon, ruling in his own right, unity becomes paramount. A look at this cast shows just where desperation leads. Senator Hubert Humphrey provides the Democratic faithful more of the same. In between every sentence paying homage to Roosevelt's legacy, Hubert Humphrey can kiss ass in the South and shake hands with liberals up north. He's not feared by the party elites, if only because he's the one scared of them, groveling for approval. Senator Robert Kennedy makes the pitch as his brother would have, far enough away from the scandal not be personally dragged down, but just close enough to channel his family's ambition. Kennedy can be anything to anyone, something old convention goers have seen far too much of, yet paired with a checkbook, he can bring most concerns to ease. Governor Walz fears nothing in the party. Shall he lose, he'll have more power back home in Alabama than any of his opponents could as president. What Walz brings to the table is a commodity that's going out of fashion, an unreconstructed Southern Democrat grabbing votes up north. Intriguing on its own, but to those who felt the civil rights issue doomed the party 4 years prior, he's a force to be reckoned with. I'll go ahead and read the events first and break down the VPs and stuff first before I comment any further. So this is for Triple H's nomination. For a generation of Democrats who grew up at the altar in the shadow of late great FDR, the search for a candidate who could come close to matching their patron's same ambition and ability had been an exercise in frustration, marked by 2 defeated candidates and 2 disappointing presidencies. They waited for so long through Eisenhower, Kefauver, and Kennedy without finding a true heir to the New Dealer legacy. Now they watch as the senator from Minnesota, Hubert H. Humphrey, ascended to the podium, accepting his nomination with grace, vigor, and gratitude, with solemn vow to uphold and fight for the rights of labor, to recommit the Democratic Party to let the great cause of a century, the struggle for human rights abroad, and the struggle here at home. To complete the work of President Roosevelt and all the New Dealers alongside him, whose legacy now entrusted Humphrey to finish what had begun on that day in March 3 decades ago. There were tears in his eyes, and there were tears in theirs. The man who'd brought together farmers and laborers and the Democrats in Minnesota, who'd pushed the party forward on civil rights, who'd stood stalwart as an unwavering beacon of liberalism on the state floor. For so long, he'd felt that the burden of history was his to bear. Each failure to obtain a higher office was a setback, all leading up to this ordained moment. He was now the heir to Jefferson, Jackson, Wilson, and Roosevelt, a champion worthy of his party. The question that remained was whether he could deliver victory. So, Hubert Humphrey, as a front runner with, I believe it's Leroy Collins, I think that's his name, a senator from Florida. Classic Northern-Southerner divide. Humphrey as a moderate choice is a bit interesting. He was a pretty unifying figure for liberals in this. I'm reading a book about him, so I have a little bit of recent knowledge about him. It was also pretty clearly pro-civil rights. Like, it cost him a lot of issues early in his career. I haven't read later, so I can't quite comment yet. I know later in his life, after he lost in '68, he became a little bit more hardline on social issues. Just hard-nosed, maybe. But he was also the person who put in the plank to demand civil rights in the 1948 Democratic platform. And that pissed off the South majorly. So they mention it more here, so I'm a little bit more... I'm a little bit less unnerved here, but I don't know exactly what I'm even trying to say at this point. Probably, I don't know. Him as the establishment figure and Kennedy, I guess part of my concern is that they seem a little bit too similar. And the line between the establishment and Kennedy, perhaps. I don't know. They'll probably explain a little bit the difference a little bit more. I guess I do see a bit of a difference immediately with the VP. Well, let's get there. Let's stop meandering. It's a sweltering hot day in July when the democracy meets to crown its favorite son. It's anointed nobility awaiting its chosen new sovereign. Grandees circle the hall, party hacks, labor leaders mingling with delegates from across America from every corner, every creed, and every origin. He's young and sharp and handsome. Robert Kennedy, Massachusetts senator, scion of party royalty. A bright young thing here to avenge his brother. To fulfill his father's family ambition, to carry forward the torch of democracy. He's lined up on the podium to accept the crown with grace and humility. His Boston accent nearly drowned out beneath the roars of Kennedy, Kennedy, Kennedy. It hides the murmurs of discontent from the party's courtiers, the half-hearted applause among its grandees, with skepticism from labor bigwigs, and silent suspicion among its intelligentsia, which had earlier combined to lead Texas, Minnesota, and a dozen other states against the Bobby Bone Homie. The announcement of Walter Reuther, head of United Auto Workers, as the running mate to roaring applause from the convention-goers, did not allay their worries that their nominee would be a man sullen and vindictive, petty and self-righteous, in equal measure. That from the democracy's dukes and kings, they had to elevate the Black Prince of the Kennedy clan to lead the party to reclaim the White House, and to reclaim his family honor. Okay. It's more of a defined difference, I should say. I should have read this a bit more thorough. I'll be honest. There we go. I guess that makes some sense. Kennedy seems more diehard and less willing to compromise, even if it tears apart the party, while Humphrey will be more of a uniting figure. I don't quite know if that plays out to their characters. Well, Humphrey was a bit of a appeaser to LBJ, but that's because of the way he saw that man as a mentor, and he's loyal to a fault, which you can see when he didn't distance himself from LBJ after all that nonsense in his term, which probably cost him the election in '68 against Nixon. Okay. Let's move on to the last one. Standing up for America, which is ironic because George Wallace becomes crippled in our timeline and can't stand up. It's a sweltering hot day in July when the forces of North and South face each other across the convention floor. Dixie's sons loose unfurled flags and count the moments down. They are here on Northern soil, and they intend to celebrate a Southern triumph. The disparate forces of a union drawn from Massachusetts and Texas and Minnesota stand divided. The quarrels and grudges of its leading men had seen them split and defeated. Now they stand. Walter waits against a heavy weight, but they intend to fight. They do not last long as the roll call counts down, and the state after state falls in the count for Governor Wallace, and whatever faint hopes of deadlock is shattered when the center breaks and the ghost of Pickett's charge crests the stone wall when John Connally releases the South's wavering sons, and the stampede towards the Alabama governor begins. His acceptance speech is drowned out by jeers and yells, but when the vice presidential nomination appears, the convention descends into pandemonium, the colonels and lieutenants, Wallace's floor managers, losing total control. It's Wisconsin who emerges first, calling Proxmire for VP. It's seconded by Texas, then California, North Carolina, and then when the gavel comes down and the votes are counted, their ticket is made. Governor George Wallace, Southern Firebrand, and Senator William Proxmire, Maverick liberal. The democracy now marches into battle, half slave and half free. Now, Wallace is undeniably distinct from any of these other guys. These two are both very pro-civil rights. At least with my knowledge, I can't even tell you which one is more civil rights. My gut tells me Humphrey, because, Kennedy told MLK to kill himself. But he also had a crazy resurgence with civil rights groups. It's hard to say. It's not going to be George Wallace. And then the balancing of Proxmire is going to be an interesting dynamic, I'm sure. Meanwhile, When not in battle, the Nixon White House can finally direct its full attention to re-election. Marching without opposition to the convention in Dallas, Nixon must test new number twos for purity. While out of his control, the Kennedy trade was a disaster. In his previous number two, Schopel is dead and buried. This time Nixon wants a strong man, a fighter like him, a man like Jerry Ford. So I won't read this one. It's just them agreeing to nominate Ford for the VP. But here cometh the hour. Some, like junior Congressman Rogers Morton, looked up at the podium with confidence and admiration. The likes of Barry Goldwater contemplated their nominee with unreadable eyes. Others merely seemed happy to be there. Beyond the podium stood Richard Nixon, not as unsteady as he'd been the first time around. This time he had the full confidence of a GOP for a second term free from any divided government. Evident from the way the RNC officials almost officiously guided him from point to point, it secured the loyalty of whatever delegate holdouts remained. Nixon was going to put that support to use. He wouldn't let anyone call him a loser anymore. He was going to show strength. A better way to do that than kicking Jack anyone who's down. Ladies and gentlemen, above all else, what we need right now is a clean and honest government. One that does not hide vital information from the people. Sorry, that's me assuming that Nixon breaks character and starts laughing when he says that. Applause. Nixon resists the urge to smirk as he observed delegates laughing, obviously telling jokes at Kennedy's expense. What we need is to speak from the silent majority of the American people, those that demand an honest government and a fair shake for life. Seconds passed by in the lead for the Democratic nomination. Nixon stressed the image he had built, brick by brick for the public eye over the decade he spent in politics. Cometh the man, for real this time. So, assuming Nixon is impeached, it seems like it's a pretty clear railroaded. Nixon gets the renomination, Gerald Ford becomes president. Easy enough. Should Nixon find himself out of power, leaving Warren to lead a headless party convention, only one man can fill the void left behind. Senator Barry Goldwater, giving voters a real choice, stands for nomination ripe for the taking. Paired with the equally principled Senator Chase Smith of Maine, the two stare down oblivion in November, lest the Democrats fail to find any stability of their own. Well, I'll go ahead and read this one. I would remind you, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, said the nominee, and the screams within the convention were deafening. San Francisco's acclaimed Cow Palace Hall was stuffed, the air muggy and the cheers joyous, vindicated. The masses within delegates from across the nation could be seen perfectly atop the stage. And throughout his thick-rimmed glasses, the nominee could pick out every single one. Barry Morse Goldwater looked upon the convention. His convention reminded himself, the Eastern establishment, that hack Nixon and Nelson Rockefeller did their damnedest, but he had made it to the top and fought back against their attempts at staying his hand. The civil rights blank, that damn silly one denouncing extremism, the last blank telling everyone that they ought to get along, no matter what, all motions defeated. Above it all, Goldwater looked down to the throngs of delegates cheering his name. Just below him, he knew, were the various moderate delegations, silent as could be. Not that he minded. All the better for them to watch his grand final victory over all they stood for. The other delegates, his delegates, he could tell, had never known a victory as grand and enthralling as this. This moment, the vindication of all they had fought for, had at last been met. Through the pains of Eisenhower, Kaufer, and Kennedy, in the face of the countless liberals that stood in their way, they had finally held a satisfaction that could be felt in every war before them, that could be guarded closely in the chest of a conservative that knew the answer was not to retreat, but to charge forward. That the road to success was paved not with compromise, but an embrace of all they knew to be good and righteous. The crowd screamed at Goldwater as he waved to them, for he was the salvation of their beliefs. He held forth their cause, with which, deep down, all of them knew to be right in their hearts. The New Yorkers, the spineless moderates and liberals, every one of them, Goldwater knew, would just have to live with it. Wonderful, wonderful TV. Presidential elections are similar to those of midterms, an election held in all 50 states on the same day, but with significantly more money involved. Fitting the same structure, they both aim to build momentum across the states, making them the best fit for your coalition to deliver victory. So we have a potential hypothetical. I believe this is the pre-election stuff where you can do campaigning. And this is Humphrey and Collins versus Nixon and Ford. This is where this map starts off the bat. You can see the blue states and their degrees of safeness, as well as the red states and the degree of their safeness. And you also see some purple states, California, Arkansas, West Virginia. Seems pretty dynamic. We also have presidential polling. Well, that's presidential polling. This is the actual election mechanic come the day of the election. You see states as they solidify from one candidate or the other. They change color. You see Nixon crosses the line. Oregon decides to say psych last minute and go for Nixon. Poor Humphrey. After November, the country has finally reached a crossroads. Split 5 different waves, the past 3 years of conflict has shaped the world in which the president will take office. Whether he's departed, or inaugurated into a second term, the president's Nixon faces will live on. Threats, foreign or domestic, to tranquility the president wishes to keep will continue to rise. New leadership in Germany and Japan, new enemies in the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Europe, are raised not only to retain what is already theirs, but to dislodge the other, bring the post-war system to an end, and remake the world in their image. Whether the U.S. could save its allies and the people of the world from anti-democratic forces depends on that nation's ability to save itself, in many ways, from itself. In many ways, it will be the responsibility of 1964's champion to navigate these problems and survive, stronger than before, into the unfolding new order. They said the name. So, here's a start with Nixon. It looks like you retain Earl Warren no matter what happens, which is interesting. So we have the new Nixon, you have Executive Order 11541, and you have different stuff. DuPont Circle, New Republic, New Federalism, interesting stuff going on. He would never admit it, but the president enjoyed New York considerably more than his home state of California. In New York, there's a sense of history to respectability. It's a place destined for big shots, not like podunk Los Angeles, a web disconnected community bound by a highway. The speech where he made an awkward half concession, half victory speech 4 years ago. Now, when his staff asked him where he wanted to have his election party night, he knew his choice. New York City. Plaza Hotel. It showed those Evil League bastards that he was just as good as they were, if not more so. It showed that he'd made it. And so, the president found himself in New York on election night. From the privacy of the penthouse suite, he watched each state come in. He noted each state he'd won with a sense of grim determination and bitterly cursed each loss. They could have managed things better, he muttered, if only better handled Douglas, the blacks, the issue in Madagascar. He stewed, he raged, he blamed his party, the media, and himself. Near midnight, the networks had called it. He'd won re-election, had won fully and in his own right, had freed himself from the shackles of Kennedy and the Democrats, and all those whiny so-and-sos the bosses had forced down his throat. Another man might have celebrated the victory, might have accepted his laurels. Instead, he gave a miserable sigh and turned to his aides. Well, let's go downstairs and give the people a show. We'll see how the bastards plan to fuck us in the morning. It's a very Nixon way to respond to that. But very interesting. So we have Nixon, the establishment Republican. Then we have the storm with Barry Goldwater, the new Republican. The collection of Oregonians stood in the heart of Franklin County. The men of the Nixon White House gathered in New York exile. They had watched as Warren made a mess of their finely tuned operation, how a band of kooks and car dealers overran the party of Lincoln and delivered the Republican nomination to their Arizona acolyte. They had looked on as the candidate campaigned by a blunder and gaffe, scorned by the nightly news and dismissed by the Fourth Estate. Now, on election night, they assembled, awaiting the vindication of a landslide defeat, one certain to make the Republican Party turn to a saner, better man. To men, to statesmen who could win. Of course, there were precisely two men in the grand old party who could claim to be winners. One had lost the Second World War, while the other mingled in the good spirits as the first polls closed. Talk of late swung to the Goldwater of momentum in the election's home stretch had been dismissed as what it had to be, the imagined optimism of a far-right fringe. If they couldn't accept his lunacy, then the country certainly wouldn't. The results said otherwise. The erosion of the once solidly Democratic South had been political reality when Nixon was running for high office. Now, Goldwater was putting up numbers unseen since the days of Reconstruction. Then the Midwest trickled in, the old Republican heartland, who seemed to find the party's new Western champion to be not nearly as crazy as its leaders seemed to believe. Then the Mountain West. The cheer was gone. The president, the former president, remained drink in hand as he watched the country go to hell, as Barry Goldwater strode confidently on the stage, thanking all supporters and pretending as if the results were no surprise at all. There'd be phone calls to make later, begrudging congratulations, and battles for ears and influence, but for now, Nixon drank. Congratulations, Mr. President-elect. So we have the Goldwater presidency. We have bring decency to White House. We have a lot of economic stuff down here, I'm guessing. And then we have... I think this is going to dictate his approach to civil rights and the Civil Rights Act passed. Whether the Constitution comes first or what's passed is passed. So I'm guessing Constitution comes first means he's going to try to go after the Civil Rights Act. What's passed and passed probably means he's just going to let it be. Just not potentially legislate for any more. And then the problem in Mississippi, obviously settled by Mississippi, leans heavy on his states' rights doctrine. Barry Goldwater, when talking about civil rights, is the one guy who talks about civil rights or states' rights and actually means that the states should do it. Not just a covert call for racism, as far as I can tell. Because he was personally pro-civil rights. He desegregated Arizona in the Senate lunchroom. But he really doesn't like this federal government telling people that black people should be equal. He wants the racists to come to that conclusion, which has its clear problems there. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in 64. He's already a candidate in 68, and he can revoke the Civil Rights Act potentially, which is interesting. I'm curious how much of that old tree they're going to keep, including the potential union busting, potentially through illegal means, and how much they're going to rework. But here we have Hubert Humphrey, the establishment Democrat. In all, about 40 people crowd the Humphrey campaign headquarters, a converted suite at the Leamington Hotel in Minneapolis, now serving as the heart of a nationwide operation. Aides, friends, Democratic farmer labor functionaries, journalists, the candidate's wife, and the man himself were spread across the suite's largest room, watching the results come in around a television. Phones rang off, their handlers, radio screech, a cacophony of noise and information, all coalescing to one fact. He was winning. Never say die. Never count you. Never. The Democratic nominee was shaking, his teeth clattering, watching and listening, silently begging and pleading to God, waiting for the one thing he'd wanted more than anything. It wasn't until well after midnight that Walter Cronkite appeared before the American people and said, in his resolute newsman voice, that results indicated an electoral college victory for the Humphrey Collins ticket. Peace broke into chaos, and those present rushed to congratulate their president-elect. But Humphrey was too quick. The senator from Minnesota flung himself onto his knees before the television set, embracing in its arms. "Oh, beauty." He sobbed, his cheeks against the bulbous glass screen. "Oh, Lord, it's mine. Isn't that scoundrel's, but it's mine. Oh, thank you, God." Then he turned to his wife, Muriel, who stood above him with empty arms. She was crying, quietly unlike the rest. How could she not cry? "Isn't this the best thing? Oh, the best." So, the Humphrey presidency, I'm trying to figure out what this is. A new Democratic dynasty, him trying to position himself in the line of FDR. So it looks like he's deciding whether he wants to focus on Roosevelt's legacy or Eisenhower's legacy, which I imagine this would be a more New Deal style. This would be a bit more of an ambiguous one. Left hook for equality, right hook for justice. I'm guessing this is going to be between housing and school segregation. So either going more after northern inequality or going after the South more on civil rights. I'm just speculating. I have no idea. Interesting to me as well, though. But now we have Bobby Kennedy, the activist Democrat. Robert F. Kennedy's retinue had gone off to Boston's Faneuil Hall to watch the election results. This suited his father, Joseph, just fine. He was certain that the boy would be intolerable in victory or defeat. If he lost, he'd be a pathetic, whimpering mess that he'd been as a child before had beaten that sensitivity out of him. If he'd won, he'd be insufferable. He'd spent the entire night at the old man's knee, demanding to know if Joseph was finally proud of him, if he'd done the family right. From the living room, deep within the Kennedy compound, Joseph B. Kennedy scowled. He paced the room with his wife, Rose, watched the television intently, and servants bustled about, trying to make themselves unseen. If only been different. If only Joe had come back from the war, the heir he'd always wanted. If only fate hadn't given him a weak cripple for a second-born, making all of his pretensions of public service pointless and absurd. If only Bobbity wasn't such a reed of a man, so desperate for approval and affection that he'd bend in whichever direction he thought might best receive sunlight. If only Roosevelt hadn't shattered his own ambitions, hadn't deceived him into thinking they might be allies, hadn't made him accept that ambassadorial post. So many bitter disappointments. If it had been him and Hitler up there instead of Hitler and Dewey, they'd be in a different world. He'd still have a son. America would still have its dignity. From the couch, Rose clicked her tongue. Joseph turned to see the screen awash with scenes of celebration. Democrats chanting, Kennedy, Kennedy, as they waved banners and waited for their savior to address them. Robert had won the election, after all. Joseph continued watching as the butler strode into the room towards him. Sir, your son Robert's on the telephone. He wondered if you might have a word. Joseph grunted and then followed the man out of the room. You can note that the same guys who wrote W wrote this. It's very W-coded. Except, actually, probably accurate. In this case. So, this is the Kennedy presidency. Silver spoon in hand. Dirty laundry. I get the sense, piece without scrutiny especially strikes me as interesting. Government and the gaps, dirty laundry. Because RFK's current tree orients around using unscrupulous means like COINTELPRO to expand things. I can imagine that rearing its head again. There's that. There's the fact that this guy's also made things that never were. And there's a whole FBI mechanic where you can hijack the FBI. It's going to be interesting to see how that differentiates itself. Region locked, I'm not quite sure what that means. Maybe they're going to be focusing on unique aspects of civil rights, depending on what's going on. The poncho is kind of throwing me off there, pushing me that way. And then, perhaps most interestingly, George Wallace, the United States of Alabama. For 4 months, Tommy turned his speed and managed the Wallace campaign off coffee, fast food, and stomach acid. Resting when he could, sleeping on his feet, as he ran a 50-state campaign while flying by the seat of his pants. 4 grueling, punishing, unrelenting months on the campaign trail had come down to counting results in a packed hotel room, listening to the news anchor prattle about trends and implications. But then they'd won. A victory, a relief, a trance he could hardly believe. Hardly had time to savor. He couldn't find the candidate, the president-elect. He'd scanned the room, at first in a daze, but then in panic. The cameras were rolling, the anchors were waiting to go live with the victory speech of the next president. The crowds of the victory party were waiting to hear the man they had trusted, contributed to, and funded. He was frantic, darting through the hotel in a lazy stupor. He remembered the governor telling him that he and Asa Carter were going after some drafts, but he felt a hand on his shoulder. Turned face to face with the next president of the United States. Relax, Tom. Hell of a job. Hell of a campaign. Get some rest. You earned it. Mr. President-elect, your speech. I know. Later he would look upon the night with horror, a shameful triumph. For now he would watch, as would millions of Americans, as the 45-year-old governor took to the podium brimming with energy, thanking the nation and the cheering crowds, those brave enough to do what others had told him he could not be done. A century ago, Lincoln had triumphed. Now, a century later, Dixie struck back. Thank you for standing up to America. Now, the Wallace presidency seems undeniably interesting. Numerable evils. You have a full house. This is a very unsettling focus, and then true Jacksonianism. I'm curious if there is going to be a dynamic with Wallace. Same to, from what I can tell, might be the case with Goldwater here. Whether he tries to keep it a solely states' rights issue. Because in our time, in currently, he can force segregation on the United States, which is kind of goofy. It's interesting. It's kind of funny. Not funny in a comical way. Kind of interesting in a play way, but also it's kind of a ambiguous one. I wonder if there's a dynamic where he could play racial moderate or play like he became later on after he got shot and talked with Shirley Chisholm, or if there's a decision between that or full-blown segregationist Wallace, or maybe some middle ground in between that. But we're going to have to wait and see, I suppose. But here's the editor's note. Thanks for reading the diary. We hope you enjoyed what you saw. We'll be checking in periodically with further updates on American explorations into new presidents, both revealed and unrevealed. More to come. Stay tuned. The Dopp comment. Bennett sacrificed himself in Squid Games to save baby Hubert Humphrey. Yeah, so, NPP is gone. Walls Bennett is gone. I don't know if anyone's really crying over Walls Bennett. It was by far the most boring out of all of them. So there's a guy who didn't even like Bennett, who didn't even dislike Bennett, but there wasn't much of a personality behind him. Looks like Romney would have made more sense, but I'm beleaguering the point here. Okay, so very interesting stuff right here. Second term Nixon, let's go. Someone remembering his JFK stuff from Madison. That's what I really like. A lot of things he never wore jokes. Bobby. Nixon now more than ever. No one's dared to go past 2 terms in office. There's content all the way 77 willing presidents to pursue a 3rd term in office. I mean, I'm sure Nixon would try. I mean, Watchmen was oriented around the fact that Nixon wouldn't fucking resign and kept running for office. And since FDR didn't go after a 3rd term, there's nothing in the Constitution that's limiting him to do that. So it's going to be interesting to see what's up. 4 terms Nixon into Gus Har. All the letters just don't fuck up my autocracy. Interesting. I'm going to scroll through more of his comments to see what's up. Control map looks kind of... It looks a little amateurish. I admit, I don't know how much they could really fix it, necessarily. I'm sure they probably could, but I don't mind it too much. Supreme Court, I think, is cool. Yeah, they didn't explain what the circles meant. I'm sure they did. They will eventually. Alright, Better Call Barry, funny. Looking through some of these. Always fun. I'm interested. I gotta say. This is coming, I think they said late 2026. Because of course, TNO can't announce an update, and it'll immediately come out. I thought there was gonna be a pop-up that looked at that. Overall, I gotta say I like this a lot. There's a lot of I think really clever changes to the lore here that make a lot of sense to me. I'm curious what the tangible differences between RFK and Humphrey are going to be when it comes to policy, because policy-wise, I mean, Kennedy, I think, will probably do some shady shit behind the scenes. Humphrey seems more like a moderate figure, like a more institutionalist figure, I should say. But the Nixon stuff seems particularly interesting to me. I'm curious to see any of his stuff, honestly. It seems like it's going to be a lot of fun. I like a lot of the things they're doing here. I can't think of anything that I'm immediately unnerved about. The NPP going is going to be a little bit of a sad moment. I am, there's a nostalgia there that we're going to miss out on. But overall, it was kind of goofy lore-wise. And my whole philosophy is that if they're removing something and making it better, I don't mind too much as I might miss some of the stuff. My only fear, and I think they said that they're not going to do this, that the content is actually going to go until 1977. But I think if they are going to do such a major change, they need to make sure that it's thorough. At least content equivalent to what you get before. So full terms for the 64 and the 68 candidates. Visit Heavy 2 would be an awesome cherry on top. Mainly because I think a lot of people were a little bit irked by the Britain content. I believe you could change it in the rule, so it didn't matter anyway, but the Britain content was great, but you only had the collaborator path and, like, skeleton content from there. And even the collaborator content only went a couple of years. So if they avoid that and they implement full content, I think this is going to go just fine. Overall, I like it. I think if there are any updates or leaks, actually, real quick, I think, where is it? Make sure I open that so the tab opens to that. They did announce the full first-term Nixon tree, so let's take a look at that real quick. We have a contract with America, pork barrel, public goods, no red or blue America. Okay, Obama. A lot of the weird, idiosyncratic Nixon policies here are interesting. Richard Nixon is a fascinating fucking character, the more I look into him. Little anecdote from my personal academic life to add that. One of my American history professors was like a pretty open Marxist. He was also one of the most stingent Nixon supporters I have ever met. He said that Nixon was the most left-wing president economically since LBJ. He said Watergate wasn't that bad. It was pretty common for everyone else. Didn't mention anything about 68. So there's this weird idiosyncratic nature where he's a pretty conservative guy, but he has weird stuff where you can have Marxists praising him. So I'm really curious to see what they're gonna bring for Nixon come around. Oh, there it is, the committee to re-elect the president. Would you look at that? You have stuff like auditing the auditors, closing loopholes. This is like tax stuff. Business councils helping out with economic stuff. Anti-union crackdown. Whistling past Dixie. Civil rights stuff, I'm guessing here. Strange Fruit. Is that a reference to that one song about lynching that Kanye sampled? Liberal values. This is also economic, civil rights stuff, I think. Environmentalist stuff here. And then economic stuff, too. And then this seems to all be foreign policy options as well. All right. I think there's nothing else to really go over, but I did quite enjoy this. If there's any more content that comes out, I'd be more than willing to check it out. I don't know if any of the other dev diaries have come out. Let me see. Dev diaries. What was even the one before? Deep Freeze, right? There's also like the New Russia. That could be relevant later on. So if you guys would like me to go back and read that, go ahead and leave so in the comment section below. It's a bit too late for like the Guangdong stuff like that, for me to read that because the mod's already out. Same with like Toolbox Theory, any of the old ones, it doesn't make sense. But if you'd like me to go ahead and read the new Russia, I'm more than willing to do that. And as soon as any other updates come out, I will go ahead and check them out. But until next time, if you want to see any of my content in the future, I do a lot of Parts of Iron 4 mod content. Lots of Kaiserreich, lots of TNO, odd stuff here and there, Kaiser Redux. Just anything that catches my fancy. I do new campaign drill stuff. I'm trying to branch out and play some more games in general as well. Anything with strategy or storytelling spear. So if any of that interests you guys, hit the sub button and hit the notification bell. And yeah, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. But I thank you as always for watching, my friends. My name has been Mr. Dogboat333. I thank you for watching. And I'll see you all next time. Goodbye now.